works as a range management specialist for CSU Extension in Western Colorado, based out of Grand Junction. She works with ranchers and land managers on grazing issues, rangeland monitoring, virtual fence, drought management, and more on the Western Slope. She has been in this role since 2016, previously worked for CSU's Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship from 2013 to 2016, and has MS in range management from the University of Arizona. Welcome, Retta. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. Apologize for being remote, but I am far away and I have work here on the Western Slope today. So it's nice to be able to join you virtually. So thank you, Jess and Jenna. And then I think what I'll do, I'll go pretty quickly through my slides. If you have questions, I think probably chat is the best way to do it, just because I might not be able to hear in the room. Um, and with that, we'll go ahead. So I'm going to talk about kind of a structured way of thinking about approaching drought with the recognition that this year is unprecedented in Colorado. So we have really unique challenges this year and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. But there are kind of structured ways of thinking about the drought impacts that you may already know are going to happen. And so the whole presentation today is just really going to cover what that structure is and how you could potentially use it on your operation to think ahead and then almost pre-plan about how you're going to deal with certain impacts when and if they arise. And I'm going to be talking about that from the perspective of a project that we did several years ago, which was, well, a couple years ago, I should say, which was called the Drought Plan Program. It was a partnership with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, and we did 40 drought plans throughout the state with 40 different producers where they would apply, and we'd pair them with certain technical professionals who had expertise in the type of crops they were growing, as well as were geographically close to work with them on drought plans. So I'm going to be talking about that broader structure, which I mentioned is drought planning. And then I'm going to be drawing in some of that wisdom and some of those strategies that producers identified. And the whole point of today is I'm not suggesting anyone do anything specific. My hope is to just provide a couple of examples so that maybe you have just a teeny bit more certainty or at least some ideas as you go into what could be a really challenging year. So with that, I just want to start off. I'm not going to dwell here too long. I think if anyone's in this drought workshop, it's because you are probably concerned about the conditions that we've experienced in Colorado this year. But I do want to just briefly visit that. This is a snow telegraph. It shows snow water equivalent on the vertical axis, and it shows time on the y-axis. This is for the South Platte. I took it last week. And what it shows is the amount of water that's in our snowpack. They call it snow water equivalent. And that's really predictive or the most predictive thing we have in terms of what our stream flow volumes are. And you can see this is the blue line is the all-time maximum. The red line is the all-time minimum. The black line is where we are this year. So you can really see that impact of that heat dome in March, which melted out our snowpack. On the West Slope, it's about 6 weeks ahead of time. So we're really looking at an unprecedented year. So what does this mean? I think it means that unlike maybe some years in the past, whereas we come into the spring, it's like, are we going to have a drought? Are we not going to have a drought? What's going to happen? This year, we have a lot of certainty about how bad the conditions are. And so as we're thinking about making decisions, I think this comes into play of, again, unfortunately, we have quite a bit of uncertainty about where we are sitting right now. We don't have that money in the bank in terms of our snowpack. And so we potentially could have more certainty than we normally do. Unfortunately, it's certainty in the wrong way. It's certainty about how bad things are going to be potentially. So this is just the frame of today. But one time I was giving one of these presentations and a rancher I work with was like, you know what, Retta, I really don't need any more reminders that it's dry. And I started to apologize. And then he said, but it's a good reminder to act. So again, that's kind of the whole point of today and the program that Jess and Jenna have put together and my presentation as well, is that you all do not need any more reminders that it's dry. But maybe it is a good reminder that of the things you can do, maybe it's a good time to start thinking about defining what those are or potentially taking action if you're in that kind of position. So I did want to just mention in a more positive light, what are the benefits of drought planning? And again, I'm going to go into briefly what what a drought plan is, what are the pieces that it consists of. But from the producers we worked with on that program I mentioned called the Drought Plan Program, we had the opportunity to then go back and interview almost every person who participated in that program. And so we got a lot of feedback on what it was about the program that they liked or didn't like, and what about it worked. And some of the things that we heard was just having some more structure around the decisions that you have to make in drought was very helpful. And in particular, that structure was beneficial for stress. Stress is one of the things that we have heard is a problem in drought, and it's hugely impactful for folks. So this is a quote from one of our producers that was reflected in many other comments that we got. But they felt the drought planning process takes some of the stress away. If you have 3 or 4 options, you don't have to lie awake at night to figure out what your options are. They're already written down. So that's kind of the point of today. Again, we're moving towards potentially having you define what might be some options for you. And again, we aren't at a point where there's all kinds of wonderful options. It's going to be choosing between some challenging choices potentially, but defining those in advance might be helpful from a stress reduction perspective. And we'll talk more about that. So starting out, when I'm in person, I often ask people to respond. But today I'm just going to, because I am remote, I'm going to just prompt you all to think and just have some reflection with yourself. What have you done in past droughts? Has there been anything that has worked? And what have you learned? I find as I go across the state, and I do a lot of drought work across the state of Colorado, despite the fact that this year is unprecedented, people do have a lot of experience when it comes to drought. So I would prompt you to reflect upon yourself too, or maybe talk to neighbors. What are the experiences you've had? What have you done? Maybe what's worked, what have you learned? Because I think that can really inform this year, even though this year is different. All right, so let's jump into drought planning. Drought planning I think sometimes people think it's like this big strategic plan or really complex. I think that it can boil down to just a couple of words. What we're really trying to do is just set some goals. Where do you want to go in drought? What is most important about your operation or the land you manage, etc. You're going to set some strategies. How are you going to get there? And then decision points. The decision points really help with that uncertainty piece in drought. So it's basically, when are you going to make a decision about something that might not be desirable, but might be important to decide about? So 3 parts: goals, strategies, decision points, and I'll go into depth on each of these. Before I do that, I did want to mention quickly that today, with the rest of my presentation, I'm going to be focused more on the short term, what you could potentially do this year, because that is the decision space we have. But I do want to mention that there's a broader context of drought planning. This is what you see here is from a workshop I did in Montrose a couple years ago, where we asked producers, what do they do, or how are they impacted, which is the red on the bottom. How are they impacted in drought and in general? And then on top, we wrote, how do they respond? So like the blue-green is what people said they did to respond. The red is how they said they were impacted. And we put it along this spectrum of like, what are people doing before drought? That's that preventative. What are they doing when drought seems imminent, when they feel at risk for drought? And what are they doing when we experience what you might call the drought emergency room, where we're really responding to the impacts of drought in real time? And so I just want to show this because there's a range of things you can do to prepare for drought. But right now, our decision-making space is really, I think, if you can see my cursor, it's over here. It's probably in the at-risk or even emergency room, where some of the longer-term options are not going to necessarily help in 2026. Now, 2026 could prompt you to think about what are those longer term things that could make an operation more resilient to drought long term. But there's a lot of things that I think can be done to prepare for drought that probably would not be impactful this year. So, I am a range specialist. So one of those things is like rangeland management for diversity and cover. That is most effectively done before you're in drought. It's important to do now, but you're not necessarily going to build up more cover in a drought because there's going to be such curtailed growth of the growing species. So this is just to say there's a lot you can do before drought that's not necessarily in our decision space right now. But I think it's important to just keep it at the back of your mind of how could this year inform you going forward to work towards maybe some of those longer term things. But with that, we're going to really focus in on what you can potentially do this year. And I don't know if Jess included it. She may have, but we have this little drought strategy sheet. If you do have it, it might be one useful tool to just write down ideas on the top and then maybe leave today with 3 things that you could do and when you could do them to help you cope with this drought. So that is potentially a goal for today. But with that, we're going to jump back into more detail with making a drought plan. I see that there's a chat for me. Okay, so Jess says you do all have those sheets. So if those are useful, go for them. And I think that might be one way to just hold yourself accountable, set some goals for yourself, set some strategies, and then have something that you can take home and refer back to as if and when conditions get rough. So jumping into making a drought plan. I mentioned this before. But a drought plan, really, it's those 3 words. We're talking about goals, where you're trying to go, strategies, how are you going to get there, and then decision points. When are you going to define for yourself that you can make a decision, even though you're never going to have all the decision you might want in drought? So I'll go through each of these individually so you have a better idea of how you might structure them for yourself or what you might do for yourself as you think about writing a drought plan. I do want to mention you can go really into depths on any of these. This is an example of our goals worksheet from our drought handbook, which is online. It's at droughtadvisors.org. So you could download this and get a lot more information. But simply said, I think goals are just thinking about where you want to go with your management, where you want to go with your operation, where you want to go with your land. And I think this is important in drought because drought is inherently a situation of scarcity. And so you're not going to be able to do everything that you normally do or everything you want to do, which is probably never the case for any of us. But it's important to think about what you're really prioritizing the most. I was in Jackson County last week, which is in north central Colorado, and producers there, had a range of different goals. Some people really wanted to pass on their operation. For others, their herd genetics, these were livestock operations, herd genetics were really, really important. So there's not one answer to this, but it's defining for yourself what do you most value about your operation and how are you going to manage towards that goal? So for example, in our drought plan program, people had different answers for this because of course we're all different. But one person wrote, for example, they wanted to reduce the emotional impact of drought by developing a plan for responding as signs of excess stress emerged. Another person said that their priority was rangeland health, and they wanted to prioritize it by responding early to drought signs while minimizing economic impacts. So goals can look really different by operation, but I think it's important to think, again, because not everything is on the table, it's important to think about what it is you really value about your operation and how are you going to work towards that. Which brings us to the next piece, which is strategies. So again, goals, where we're trying to go, strategies, how we're going to get there. When I think about strategies, for me, it's helpful to think about different strategy types. This is just a few different types of strategies, and this is from a workshop I did in Grand Junction, where we really thought about the future of agriculture in the greater Grand Junction area. But I think they can be helpful for, again, putting some structure and some boundaries about how we think about this challenging problem, which is drought. So, for example, strategies can be robust, meaning they work across a wide range of futures. Strategies can be what people call no regrets, so strategies that are good to do anyway. I'll talk more about this, but this might be because some decisions you may have to make in drought are not desirable, but there might be a cost to waiting too long or a cost to acting too soon. So a no regret strategy might be a strategy that regardless of what happens, it's going to benefit you. Mainstreaming, so this might be a strategy similar to what you're already doing. So that might be something that you're going to talk about today, but that amount of work and mental energy to implement it is not as much because you're already doing it. Maybe you're just expanding what you're doing. Hedging strategies are strategies that prevent or minimize the impact of worst case scenarios. Contingency strategies are strategies that can be applied or planned in advance and implemented in specific cases. So just different ways to think about that what do you do piece of drought planning. I'll talk a little bit about no regret strategies just because I think it's on all of our minds of, what do we do given the conditions? So one thing that's on my mind, whether or not you're an agricultural producer, is addressing fire risk. And Larimer County, you all have had quite a bit of experience with fire. So in some ways, you're unfortunately ahead of other parts of the state potentially. But in case you have not already, or if you don't know already, the home ignition zone really speaks to the ignitability of materials and vegetation around your house. We now know from research and simulations that houses are most likely to burn down because of flying embers and not because of the flame front. And so this really speaks to the need to remove flammable materials, vegetation, et cetera, from short distances around the home. We have this really handy guide, which is the Home Ignition Zone Guide put out by the Colorado State Forest Service. So if you haven't done this already, I think this is a great thing to consider that to me is a no regret strategy. Because if not this year, we are likely to have fire risk another year. So this might be one of those no regrets things. I also think stress management is a no regret strategy. Again, stress was something that was mentioned frequently in the drought plans that we did and by producers who participated in that program. And I do want to mention there are resources out there. For example, there's the Camp for Health program, which provides 10 free counseling sessions with ag licensed or ag friendly providers. It's specifically for ag producers and rural residents. So this might be something to consider. If counseling isn't your thing, many people on our drought plans mentioned other things that they identified as helping them with their stress, such as hanging out with family, playing with their animals or their dogs, spending time with their horse, whatever. But I wanted to highlight this one stress management practice that was identified in one of our drought plans. So this person wrote, when you get to the point that you do not care about the quality of your farming practices because it is too dry to matter, and you find yourself being curt to your family members, then it is time for a long weekend getaway to unwind and reconnect with your family. So I think this is a no regret strategy. Regardless of what happens, it may be stressful, but even if it isn't, it's always good to think about and prepare for how we're going to respond to adverse events. And there are resources. So, final no regret strategy. I think keeping records in drought is really important. I work in livestock and range, so this can be really important for some of the FSA programs that are available to folks when it's really dry that are triggered by the drought monitor. But it may be important for other folks as well. And again, it can be really important for that continued learning. What can you learn from this year that can help your operation come back even more resilient and flexible in the face of potential future droughts? And I think especially because this year is so unprecedented, we don't want this learning, but there's going to be a bunch of learning that happens. So I think keeping records is another thing folks can do. So revisiting our strategy type, I'm going to now focus a little bit more on hedging or contingency strategies. So I typically work with livestock producers. I am not 100% sure, but I think that, let me see if there's a message for me here. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the livestock and range strategies, but they all are in our drought handbook, which is at droughtadvisors.org. So I'm going to keep going here to highlight some of the specialty crop strategies that were identified in our drought plans that we worked with producers on. So I think some of these could look like using water to prioritize key growth stages, prioritizing key acreages, considering different crops or enterprises, reducing water going to non-target crops, and maximizing the resources and water that you spend on the most profitable crops. So as examples in this, on our drought plans, this was in a vineyard. Someone identified that, of course, they were going to modify and reduce their in-season irrigation of the grapevines by increasing the duration of sets and decreasing the frequency. And then they were going to use soil moisture sensors to provide a good guide for plant available water. So that was one thing someone identified as a strategy. Another person identified that they were going to plan the cropping schedule to include revenue generating crops and seedlings that have sales in May and June when there's typically more natural precipitation so that they have that revenue in the early season. So that might be another potential strategy. Other strategies might be reducing water requirements by favoring transplanted crops that are irrigated to drip systems as opposed to direct seeded crops on overhead and using conservation agriculture practices. So just ideas. I'm not saying these are appropriate for everyone or your situation, but they're just some ideas from what people identified in our drought plans. Similar and real quick with irrigated pasture. Again, just could you prioritize irrigation during spring and early summer? Again, this may be dictated by when you have water, but we do know that prioritizing that early season irrigation usually leads to higher yields, and there's a slump in growth in the middle of the summer on irrigated pasture because of grass growth cycles. So that may be one strategy. Fertilizing based on expected yield and water availability, and watering the most productive or profitable pastures, especially first. So many of the people in our drought plans did these types of strategies. So implementing an irrigation schedule to prioritize the most productive fields. And then this person wanted to irrigate with the most water efficient methods first. Another person defined the fields that they're going to cut water to first. And this is not an easy choice, but I have heard from folks that defining this in advance can give them some peace of mind because they're not scrambling as much in the moment. So this person basically defined a list of the pastures, the order in which they were going to cut water if water was short. So we've talked about goals. That's really where we're trying to go. I have 2 minutes left. Awesome. We've talked a bit about strategies, which is things you can do to get there. And then in 1 minute, we're going to talk about decision points, which is basically how can you use information that you have instead of waiting for future uncertainty to make a decision. So decision points, these are also called trigger points within the context of a drought plan, but it's basically thinking in advance, when do you have enough information to take action? This can be really important when in certain types of production system, the drought adaptation measures are not super desirable. So for example, colleagues of mine who work in peaches, a couple years ago, they had a drought. They thought they lost their water and they started really, really heavily pruning their peach trees, and then it started raining. So they did something that was like destructive for the future, and then something they had no idea was going to happen, which was rain. It started raining. So that can be an example of like how it can be challenging to make a drought decision. But there are times when we have enough information to decide what you might do. And this really comes down to, this is from a rancher I work with who's in southeastern Colorado. But basically he says the rain doesn't get you out of the drought the next day. If you don't set a timetable and stick to what you say you do, you'll say, well, I saw on the news there's a 20% chance of rain a week from Friday, so let's wait until then. So you got to quit doing that. So those are his words, but that's basically this concept. At some point, we have enough information to start making strategic decisions, and there's cases where it may benefit you to make an earlier decision versus waiting. All right, I'll skip the examples, but here's a reflection question for you, is just thinking about what's a critical decision point on your operation. When is it important for you to decide, either from the information you have in terms of weather and climate and stream flow volumes, or maybe from a market standpoint, but when is it that you could make a decision? In conclusion, a drought plan really consists of goals, where you're trying to go, strategies, how you're going to get there, decision points, defining when you have enough information to act. So you're basing your decisions on what you can know and not based on future uncertainty. In drought planning, we talk a lot about that. Hoping for rain is a great thing to do. I personally do it all the time, but it's not a drought strategy. So instead, by writing a drought plan or at least thinking through some of the strategies that are accessible to you, I'm not saying they're pretty, I'm not saying they're easy, but it can be a way to focus on the things you actually do control and act based on the things you can actually observe based rather than making your decisions based on things you don't have control over and you can't know. So that's really the point of a drought plan. And then I think this is the reflection I'd leave you with today, since you do have those worksheets, is based on what's worked for you in the past or other information that you'll hopefully learn today or from your peers. What strategies could you do this year to lessen the impact of this year's drought, even though it is likely to be a pretty impactful and probably transformative year for Colorado? So with that, we do have more resources. Droughtadvisors.org is our website. We're a coalition of different entities, but heavy partnership from Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. You can check out past webinars we've had, our drought handbook, and other resources on our website, and including this drought plan template. But with that, I think my time is up, and I just want to thank the many colleagues who've contributed to Drought Advisors, and then you're welcome to reach out to me if you have questions. I'll be on for a couple more minutes. All right, Jess, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Retta. So if you're gonna grab this, we'll pass this around, but it has a QR code for Colorado Drought Advisors. So you can go to that QR code. You could just also search up Colorado Drought Advisors on your phone, and that's where you'll find the drought planning handbook. So do you want to start passing those around, Maggie? And then we'll take questions. Sadly, I can't. This isn't like a karaoke machine, and I can't do mic and speaker at the same time. So just speak loudly if you have a question. So does anyone have any questions in the audience for Retta? Do we have any questions online? Okay, yes, in the back.
As a planned post drought, if we were to sacrifice certain perennial fields, is it anticipated that we're going to have to reseed those afterwards, or will they, in terms of drought, in kind of just like, a neutral state, just stay dry all year?
Yeah. Do you hear that, Retta?
Yeah, I did. So it's I'm assuming it's an irrigated pasture that if you can't irrigate it this year, how bad a shape is it going to be in next year? Is that essentially the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, well, Jess, you may have better local information. I think on I don't know what kind of grasses it is, but a lot of our irrigated fields here are orchard grass and smooth brome. I do think there could be some damage to the grasses, although I think if you aren't irrigating it and you don't graze it heavy, I guess I'm assuming it's a hay situation, not a grazing situation. I think there's potential it could come back next year.
Both Retta.
It's both grazed and hayed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's potential it could come back without grazing depending on conditions next year. We do know from lots of different avenues of research that really intense drought plus heavy grazing can damage rangelands or damage all grass plants. And so if it is possible to defer grazing, that is something I would do, but that might be a strategic choice because again, we're not going to have like all the choices we want, but that might be a strategic choice. I think if you did have to graze heavy in addition to not watering an irrigated pasture, that could certainly damage plants and may put you in a reseeding situation. But I guess personally, I've seen on the Western slope, it takes more than 1 year of drought to really warrant reseeding, although it's probably going to impact your productivity, especially if it's a grass hayfield. So, and then there could be, I guess, one thing we potentially could have happened on the west slope because we had an open winter in a lot of places is we could have seen some winter kill on orchard grass specifically. So I'm not sure how cold it got in Larimer County, but that could be an issue because there was no snowpack to insulate the grasses.
Yeah, at the back.
That is right up my alley. I'm curious if there's a, like, if we are reseeding, if there's a grass you recommend to help withstand these conditions in the future.
Yeah, so grass reseeding mix for drought and for the future.
Sure. Well, you're gonna love this answer. It depends. I would just say personally, I would not reseed this year. Just because we don't have the conditions. I think it potentially could be an outlay of money, and I have no idea if the person was thinking of doing that. So I would wait. I would not do it this year. I would potentially think about it in the fall, depending on what conditions have, but we won't have that water and we don't have the soil moisture to get those plants going. So this isn't a decision you need to make right now. But I think, yeah, the seeding mix really depends on your goals in the area. So that might be, I think, a longer conversation about your context. Is it an irrigated pasture situation?
The same, yeah, irrigated and raised.
Okay.
Irrigation and grazed, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of our, unfortunately, we don't have like a silver bullet irrigated pasture grass that is rapidly providing better alternatives than our historic ones. But I think it's a balance of your goals and maybe thinking about like, is this a pasture where you're expecting to not have water a lot in the future, or is it an area that most of the time does have irrigation? So I guess it's hard to answer, but I think that'd be where like Jess may have an answer or Jenna, or I would want to know more about your context um, to make a good recommendation there.
Yeah, so there's a couple seed companies that you can work with, Pawnee Buttes, Buffalo, Grass Seeds, there's even a couple others. And they have drought mixes or drought tolerant grass mixes or dry land aggressive mixes is another thing that they'll call it. You just want to look at the grasses. A lot of them are like a crested wheat or a western wheat. And smooth brome is what most of our pastures have, and that's really not good during droughts. I haven't seen really productive smooth brome pastures this year. And so what you can also do is see the minimum precipitation that the grass needs, and just kind of have that as a decision factor for what kind of grass you want to reseed with. Another thing for reseeding is you really need to know your soil type. So a soil test is what we usually say in extension to do first. High pH is going to impact what grasses you plant. High salinity is also going to impact that. High clay. So knowing what your soil is first, what your goals are, you're using it for grazing, if you're using it for haying, and then finding that right grass mix for all of those things and the right precipitation. And I have some seed like charts or grass charts for that talk about precipitation and all of those things. I can send it out after